2009 at the bottom of the real point of depth in the recession, it was 37.5 million. We're back up to 42 million now, right around 40.19 or 41.9 million. It looks like we'll finish out this year. What's interesting is that the relationship between the East Coast and the West Coast ports is quite different. The average ship that goes to the West Coast, the discharge of ships that go to the West Coast, you ask why this is important, I'll get to that in a second, it's about 6,000 TEUs. The average ship that calls through the Panama Canal to the East Coast, which rolls around the Panama to the East Coast, is 4,527, because there's a limitation on the Panama Canal today. The average ship that calls on the East Coast from the Suez, that other route from China around the Suez Canal, which has plenty of depth, is 6,300. What do those two numbers mean? That means that folks who are routing their freight from China are looking at the economies of scale that the bigger ships allow them, and we're building bigger ships, and that they're taking advantage of that and not waiting for the Panama Canal to open up to reroute that freight. It's coming by way of the Suez, it's coming by bigger ships. There are a number of ports on the East Coast today that can pull in at 8,000 and 9,000 TEU ships. Those are big monsters, and they carry a lot of freight. The challenge really for those ports is how to discharge that freight and where to move it. Two categories of freight real quick. Stationary freight and time-sensitive freight. Let me tell you a story. It's a big warehouse, a 1 million square foot warehouse in a little town called Norfolk, Virginia. Actually, Suffolk, for those of you who really know it. It's run by one of the top importers in the U.S. And they start buying the material that's going to go into that warehouse in January and February because they can buy their Christmas stuff from the offshore vendors at about a third of the price that the regular guys buy when they buy from July through August and September when they want to start stocking them. At the cheapest rate of production in the factories offshore, and they frankly care what time that freight gets there in terms of the amount of time it takes to move from the factory to Norfolk. So you'll see over the course of January, February, March, April, you'll see a truck or two. By the time we get to July, they have filled that thing up with a million square feet of Christmas stuff that's now available, it's bought at the lowest cost, it's shipped at the lowest cost. That's discretionary freight. That allows the guy who makes the routing decision to choose how he's going to manage that freight. Really important here in just a second. I want to talk about a supply chain. These are the 6 pieces of the first part of the supply chain, and those pictures are too small, I apologize. But if you look at it, it's a foreign factory, a truck between a foreign factory and a terminal, and then a terminal on the other side of the pond, and a big ship, and then an unload somewhere in the U.S., and then another rail activity, and then a train activity, and then an activity at an intermodal terminal where that container's unloaded and gets on a truck, and finally it ends up in a warehouse somewhere in the United States, somewhere in Houston, somewhere in Texas or Dallas or Houston. 11 steps went into that. This is a very simple supply chain. 11 different pieces of activity went into that supply chain. These are the guys who are the custodians of that freight. Now, what's important is there are different pieces to the supply chain. The custodians are the 11 guys who actually move the freight. But somebody, somewhere, is managing who's in charge of that freight. There's a third party, or a buyer, or a seller, who's managing that freight. And if you want to grow port freight, you want to grow throughput in a port, or a container business at a port or a warehouse, understanding who's in charge of that routing is extremely critical. Because that's the guy who makes the decision about how that freight arrived from over there to over here. Now, this is the most boring slide in the deck. Don't give up on me. I'm not done yet. This is the Incoterms, International Commerce Terms. And you say, why the heck do I need to understand it? Well, the guy on the left is the seller. The guy on the right is the buyer. And they have to agree that between the origin and destination, somebody's responsible for transportation and insurance. Okay, big deal. Well, there's a little company in San Antonio that imports a lot of interesting things. That's a grocery center. You probably shop there, or your wife does, certainly. And they buy box fans, 20-inch box fans. You guys have some of those in your garage or in your shop. And they buy about 70 containers of box fans a year. Now, that's a pretty good number of box fans, but if you're a Chinese manufacturer, it's really not. Now, this little grocery company only wants to get those box fans into San Antonio starting about in March or April and May, because they start selling them through their retail centers in June and July and August when it's hot in Texas. So they ask, does this thing have a laser on it? They require the seller to manage all aspects of the transportation over here in this relationship called DDP. Duty, delivered, duty, paid. That means the guy who is stuffing the box on the other side of the pond is responsible for that entire supply chain from over there to over here. He makes the routing decision. He's the guy that says what port it should go on, what ocean carrier it should go on, where it should be discharged, how it should get from the port to the destination warehouse where it goes into a facility, and then it gets unloaded, and finally it gets to the stores where you can actually buy the stuff. Critical, critical. And the reason it's critical is because sometimes things go bad, and you have to understand that relationship. Let's go back. Now that slide gets a lot more interesting because you understand that things have a problem from time to time. But in my business, the whole question is, where does the box stop? And for you guys, for us in Houston, for us in Texas, we have a great story in Dallas at the Alliance Park, where Perot has successfully made a relationship with BNSF as a destination. The Union Pacific is working on a relationship with used to be the Allen Group in South Dallas, to stand up a logistics center there. Those are great examples of the relationship between the port and the inland destination, but even there you lose visibility, because now after the box arrives in Dallas, then a truck does the last mile delivery. Why is that important to know where the box stops? In our business, 20,000 TEUs, those boxes, 20,000 of those drives a requirement for about 1 million square feet of warehouse space. Let me say that again. 20,000 TEUs in a supply chain drives a requirement for about 1 million square feet of warehouse space. So if you're a developer, or if you're in retail, you need to understand where you need to be. Should I do all my work from Columbus? Should I do all my work from Dallas? Should I do all my work on the West Coast from Dallas? How am I going to run my supply chain so that my stores are replenished in time, so that I have a decent array of freight of material for my consumers? It starts to get interesting here when I turn this a page or two. So we watch real closely how these supply chains work and where cargo ends up and why it ends up there, because that's where the opportunity is for development. And that's what our clients pay us to understand is, where do I build buildings that will be in the path of progress for the future? So our friends in Panama have decided to expand their canal. I will say a picture is worth 1,000 words. That's today's canal. It needs to be expanded. Today you can push about a 4,500 TEU ship through that canal. In the future, you'll be able to push a 12,500 TEU ship through that canal. Now 12,500, think about this, it's 24 containers wide from this side of the ship to this side of the ship, 24 of those in a row. That's a massive amount of infrastructure. Just think about the amount of crane strength you need to be able to reach out 24 to pick a box at the far end of that ship and bring it back in and drop it on a truck. Most of the ports in the U.S. are not adequately capable of leaning out that far with a crane, with infrastructure, with the piers, and with the rail tracks that those cranes sit on to be able to manage that size ship. So we've got not only the problem of getting those ships into the port from a water standpoint, but you've got the expense of getting that freight across the wharf into the rail, onto the railroad. The Suez Canal isn't the problem. Plenty of space, plenty of water depth. And I'm going to wrap this up pretty quick here. These are the routes that we use, primarily rail routes, traditionally from the West Coast to the major centers in the U.S. There it is. From Oakland, from Seattle, Tacoma, largely into the Northwest. That's Prince Rupert, way up in the top. Very little freight actually stays in Prince Rupert. Nobody lives there, so very little freight stays there. Here we go. There we go. One more. Vancouver. And then across to the East Coast. Come on, speed up here. There's Lázaro up to Houston, over to Atlanta. Houston as an inland port and as a port. We get about 8,000 TEU or 800,000 TEUs of freight into Houston as an import component. 800,000 boxes each year arrive in the Port of Houston that are used, either consumed locally or are moved inland for consumption. The challenge is that another 800,000 TEUs of freight come to us from the other ports around us. So the challenge really is to try to capture that and to capture more of that freight here locally so that we can build buildings, we can put jobs on the ground, we can put drivers to work, and we can go to work cross-docking that freight in the port. There's a couple others here from the East Coast. Y'all really don't care about what goes on in Jacksonville, so I'm going to move on past those. Florida, that is. There we go. All right, so what's going on in distribution and logistics? Retail has driven the storefront and supported the... Am I in trouble? It's 5 minutes till 2. Come on, dude. All right. All right, let me speed up here. Retail is changing, all right? Retail is changing in a huge way. Traditionally, you looked at a storefront as the way through which you buy and sell your stuff. And we've done that historically. Today, 91% of the transactions conducted are conducted at a traditional storefront, which is supported by a retail distribution center. That's my time. I am out of time. 2 more minutes. Today, retailers are beginning to try to figure out in that middle circle whether or not they're going to do their e-commerce, that .com thing that you keep reading about, whether or not they're going to do that in a separate facility or if they're going to do it in a blended facility like the picture on the right. Now the interesting is, 91% of all transactions are conducted today at a storefront, that window you used to go into the Walmart, Sears, wherever it is. Within 5 years, only 76% of transactions will be conducted at a traditional storefront. That affects everybody in the supply chain, everybody in the retail chain. If you're in retail, if you're in distribution, if you're in trucking, if you're an airport operator, if you're a port operator, even if you're a payment processing transaction guy, that differential move from where we are today in traditional retail to where we are going to be in e-commerce is going to physically change the entire supply chain and the logistics system. Last slide. Right here. Changes in logistics, changes in site selection, changes in warehousing, changes in hours of operation, changes in staff, changes in network requirements across every aspect of the supply chain. The new .com process, as we embrace it, as we work our way through our economic challenges, is going to fundamentally change not only the logistics from origin to through the retail center, but the logistics between the consumer and the retailer as well. And I am out of time. I'm going to say thank you. I'd love to ask some questions. Several of you are lucky enough to have a CD of this presentation on your table. And I'm done. And thank you very much. I apologize for being 2 minutes late.